Hey, hello, hi. Welcome back. I'm sure you can already tell, but we're trying out something a little different today. Is it my makeup? You wouldn't know, it's a voiceover. Anyway, today we're going to be talking about limitation orders, which is something that I talked about pretty extensively in my Stanley Marcus video. So if you haven't already seen it, I highly suggest that you click the card, should be somewhere on the screen, and go and watch that and then come back. But for those of you who might not have time to do that right now or did watch it but forgot, a limitation order is basically a restriction of goods law, for lack of a better term, that was enacted in America during World War II. So if you're ready, buckle in. In her 1942 book, The Consumer Goes to War, Caroline Ware quipped, quote, "We have struggled to keep up with the Joneses. Now both we and the Joneses must keep down," end quote. What she was trying to say to, the average American is that their patriotic duty of enabling and following the impending rationing schemes, as well as the importance of the ones that had already been established, were going to be integral to America's success in the war effort. Once the United States formally entered the war in 1941, the government recognized that a series of changes in national production needed to be made, and that included the erection of the Office of Price Administration and subsequently the War Production Board, which is the thing I talked about extensively, or at least Stanley Marcus's role in it. In his book, Thread of Victory, Frank Walton provides a brief overview of the activities of the War Production Board, which was erected in order to issue and enforce production delegation and priority orders of American manufacturing. The board was made up of about 25 industry bureaus and divisions, with each of them handling specific commodities of similar or related type. Each bureau or division was then divided into units, which were in turn composed of hundreds of employees and were all advised by dedicated committees of experts in whatever that commodities field is. So, for example, the textile, clothing, and leather division, quote, was made up of about 10 commodity or operating branches, quote, including a textile machinery branch, a dye and finishing branch, and a synthetic products branch, among others, and some of the more notable experts that were advising them included Stanley Marcus. Do you see the connection here? There were a lot of different restrictions that were enacted beginning in 1940 by the War Production Board, with L or limitation orders focusing on textile and apparel industries. Interestingly, the War Production Board and fashion industry, quote, focused on patriotism among its female customers who were told it was their duty to look attractive for morale, end quote. We're not going to talk about how kind of gross that is. We're just going to move on. We're going to push on. This push, according to Vogue's editor, resulted in, quote, the fashion industry becoming one of the leading industries in the country in the 1940s. Between 1943 and 1945, personal consumption of apparel and upkeep increased $98 per person to $117 per person. Think about how much that is in today's money. Prior to the Second World War, but after the worst of the Great Depression, the U.S. fashion industry had been experiencing a pretty steady growth in profitability and popularity, aided by, quote, federally sponsored technological advances during the Depression era, end quote. The standardization of women's sizes allowed the ready-to-wear market, which had debuted in the early 1900s, to boom. Advancement of engineering processes basically allowed workers to speed up production by 20 to 25% by utilizing the section method, which is specializing in individual sections of a garment. Just picture those how it's made videos where you've got one lady and all she does is sew zippers. And then you have this man and his whole thing is lining up the legs of pants. And then you have another lady whose whole job is to line up those lined up pant legs into a machine to be sewn into jeans or culottes or whatever. Like, that's basically what had happened here. Additionally, the utilization of man-made materials such as rayon drove the cost of production to a new low. The ability to quickly churn out these economically competitive products meant that by 1939, the United States, quote, ready-to-wear industry was solid and strong, with trained pattern makers, skilled cutters, fitters, and operators, end quote. These innovations are likely the only reason the U.S. fashion industry did not grind to a complete halt with the rationing schemes of the War Production Board, despite the nationwide reallocation of goods to the wartime effort. Caroline Ware muses on the shift of availability of textiles, specifically cotton. Quote, for years, she states, the blank windows of closed textile mills have attested the overcapacity in the cotton textile industry, end quote. However, she argues that's no longer the case in 1942. Quote, first came the huge Army and Navy demand for canvas tents, duffel bags, and other equipment, end quote, resulting in overtaxation of the textile machinery used to create them. Quote, so spindles and looms used for other kinds of cloth were shifted to canvas making, end quote. Then, summer uniforms necessitated the use of tightly woven materials which utilized finely combed yarns. Quote, equipment for making fine combed yarns and weaving high-grade cloth was limited, and spindles and looms making ordinary cloth had to be adapted for uniform materials, end quote. Acquiring jute for burlap became pretty much impossible following Pearl Harbor, with cotton bags replacing the now heavily diminished burlap supply. Wool from Australia and Argentina became scarce, unsurprisingly, due to shipment difficulties, and so cotton took up the burden of the lack of woolen goods. So in 1942, cotton went from being this overabundant material to practically worse than scarce in less than a year. So it's no wonder that the War Production Board decided that it was necessary to reduce the burden of supply to the civilian customer. One thing that I found particularly interesting is that the United States rationing scheme, unlike in the UK, never extended to clothing itself, at least when it comes to the customer-facing side. Instead, the rationing was enforced at the manufacturing level. But textiles were not the only victim to the War Production Board's rationing schemes. The clothing department was only one of several departments that handled the allocation of materials, quote, for civilian use and the management of civilian goods to include tires, sugar, coffee, and gasoline, shoes and food items like oil and fats, meats and cheese, end quote, in 1940. By 1942, the textile industry faced rationing of dyes, fiber, labor, as well as metal usage for sundries like zippers and buttons, except for military or essential use, through the development and enforcement of Limitation Order 85. Before I really get into the limitation order that, quote, froze the fashion of 1942, I want to take a second to talk about the popular silhouette of a fashionable early 1940s woman. An hourglass shape maintained popularity in this era, which was both naturally and artificially enhanced through strategically placed padding and gathering. Slight gathers of fabric at the sleeves or the application of shoulder pads, elongating the width of the shoulders, were common, quote, contributing to the boxy silhouette of the period, end quote. Wider waistbands were popular, accentuating the wearer's waist, though their widths were reduced in the limitation order. The waist of most garments was typically settled at the natural waistline as opposed to the slightly higher waistline of the 1930s. Hemlines tended to be slightly higher than the 1930s for daywear, beginning at what now is referred to as T-length, or about mid-calf. But Limitation 85 raised the hemline significantly to just below the knee, which was such a scandalous reduction in length to the more modest-minded women that letters of protest were not uncommon in the first months of application. Two-piece suits, which began to see a pretty decent rise in popularity in the mid to late 1930s, continued to be a common fixture in early 1940s men's fashion. Military-inspired looks were also, unsurprisingly, very popular, reflecting the current events of the time, and continued to rise in popularity as women were encouraged to join the various women corps of the armed forces. In his role as the head of women's and children's apparel of the War Production Board, Stanley Marcus restricted yardage and labor by enforcing a series of design rules to be adhered to by the fashion industry nationwide under that Limitation Order 85. It had a huge impact by design on the clothing being produced en masse, and the limitations were numerous. A non-exhaustive list of limitations is included in my previous videos, so once again, I request that you go and watch it. But for a quick sum up, there were a series of prohibited sleeve styles. Skirts had a maximum sweep, and an evening dress had a maximum sweep of about twice the size of a regular skirt. Waistcoats and cuffs did not escape unscathed, and neither did pockets. With the absolute restriction of no pocket patches on jackets or coats. In 1943, Limitation 85 was amended to establish, quote, the maximum measurements for the body basic or untrimmed dress, end quote. And this established an even more restrictive limit on maximum yardage of trimming to be utilized per dress. According to Frank Walton, quote, this order saved millions of yards of cloth and prevented a style change back to long and full dresses, end quote. Interestingly, bridal, religious, and judiciary garb did not fall under Limitation 85, nor did period-specific theatrical costumes, though Hollywood strived to work within the limitation order and generally attempted to reuse period costumes as often as they could. But any contemporary clothing that was made for a Hollywood film had to adhere to the limitation order and were made in accordance with the regulations. Also, interestingly, maternity garb was restricted, not quite as much as clothing made for women who were not pregnant, and it wasn't even a category until 1943 as part of the body basic scheme. Other limitations included reduction of ornamental details, replacements of metal zippers and enclosures with button plackets, and there is so much more that I can't get into all of it here, but I suggest looking up Jonathan Wolfer's 40s fashion from siren suits to the new look in the chapter called Independence and Limitations if you want to see way more. So, in order to make these limitation orders more palatable, at least specifically for the fashion ones, they were cleverly, quote, leaked to popular fashion magazines like Women's Wear Daily and Vogue. And I found this fantastic poem in a summer edition of Fashion Digest, which was published in 1942, where they're basically summarizing the points of the limitation order, and it's called Ode to 7th Avenue. If you'll forgive me, I'm going to read it. Thou shalt not upon a frock drape over skirt or apron, nor venture forth with any frock that has a scarf or cape on. The sweep must be within the bounds of 78 inches, and make no gown with tucks or pleats, not even little pinches. Include no slip that can't be seen, nor zipper up a placket, and never dare to make a matching hood or jacket. Thou must not set into the frock such sleeves as leg of mutton, nor trim a dress for beauty's sake with ornamental buttons. Isn't that just beautiful? And it was, it's educational. I love it. Basically, what happened with this limitation order is that Stanley Marcus was able to dictate what was and wasn't fashionable during the wartime era, and heavily relied upon the general public to essentially police themselves on following the restrictions, even though they themselves, as consumers, did not have those restrictions placed on them. Isn't that kind of interesting? I don't know. I think it's interesting. One One cool example that I think, I want to mention, so I'm gonna. The popularity of bias cut dresses was really high in the 1930s, but the increase of the boxier shape was clearly hastened by yardage restrictions, because bias cut dresses, in fact, any bias cut garment, requires the cutting of all pattern pieces to be done on flat, unfolded material, and therefore isn't great for fabric saving techniques. Cutting on the bias requires aligning pieces at the 45-degree slant between the weft and the warp of a material, extending the space necessary between different pattern pieces to ensure an equitable amount of stretch while avoiding overlap. Also, any bias cut garment that utilizes a print requires extra care to align the pattern pieces in such a way that it'll promote like an unbroken image or hide the placement of seams to make sure that the print at least appears unbroken. And bias cut dresses and skirts both require a settling time after they've been assembled, which in turn increases the amount of time that's required for the garment to be considered finished, and it also increases yardage waste. Bias cut garments, though form flattering when they're cut correctly and slinky when worn, take so much more fabric and so much more time to construct. So while the fashion was already slowly going out on its own by 1942, the exit of the bias cut dress was absolutely hastened by those yardage restrictions that were in place with the limitation order. Shortened skirts and suit jackets over the course of the 1940s can also be attributed to the fabric reduction measures taken at the manufacturing level. Quote, by the 1940s, before the United States entered the Second World War, suits were a staple item in women's wardrobes. Many suit styles were styled after men's suits. Jacket lengths were long, with long, narrow lapels at the end of the 30s, end quote. However, by the late 1940s, suits with bolero jackets, which we may refer to as a shrug jacket now, and Eisenhower jackets, quote, that were slightly bloused above the waist, gathered to a fitted belt at the waist, end quote, were increasingly popular, which pushed the previously popular super long jackets out of the fashionable silhouette to make way for the waist crop jacket of the 1940s. Additionally, the continued rise in popularity of separates not only allowed women to maximize their wardrobe, because if you buy a suit jacket separately from a dress or a skirt or a blouse, then you can mix and match to extend your wardrobe. They were explicitly encouraged to through the implementation of Limitation Order 85. Retailers previously used to sell apparel as single units, a dress with a matching jacket, a suit with a matching coat, etc. But under Limitation 85, the selling of more than two pieces of clothing at one price was strictly prohibited. Thus, the rise of popularity of separates. The most apparent evidence of the War Production Board's impact on the American fashion after the introduction of the limitation order is actually in the wedding industry. Wedding dresses did not fall under Limitation 85, like I said. However, when, quote, examining wedding dresses illustrated in U.S. Vogue and Harper's Bazaar between 1939 and 1945, many designs lacked prohibited style features like prohibited sleeve styles, wide sashes, and the use of ruffles, end quote. Wedding dresses of this period are simple, typically made of rayon rather than natural fibers, and were generally without excessive ornamentation and without long trains. They also tended to be slim at the hips and through the skirt, and frequently unadorned. Interestingly, it was not wholly uncommon for women to skip the white wedding dress altogether, opting instead for Sunday best dress suits. This dressing down trend was really popular with Hollywood starlets of the time, such as Janet Leigh and Bette Davis, and can be observed in photographs of wedding parties between the years of 1941 and 1945. Patriotic colors, military insignia, and star motifs are common themes in women's fashion even before the United States entered the war in 1941. During the war, cap badges and sweetheart brooches, incorporating the insignia of the boyfriend or husband's regiment or brigade, were made specifically as mementos for girlfriends or wives on the home front. Military-style hats became super popular during wartime years, But it's worth noting that the style typically reflected 19th century fashioning rather than the contemporary military covers or hats of the time. Ready-made clothing in red, white, and blue textiles became even more popular in the United States after they entered the war in 1941. Go figure. As limited prints were produced and sold for fundraisers, such as the British American Ambulance Corps BAAC prints sold in March 1941. After entering the war, special war-themed textiles continued to remain popular, such as the parachute or wartime white fabrics. Accessories such as hats presented the primary avenue through which young girls and women could seek novelty of fashion. Hats did technically fall under a conservation order that was issued by the WPB, but the millinery trade didn't really experience those adverse effects. A circumference limit was enacted, which was 48 inches, and veiling was limited to a single yard. But there was such a variety of hat styles, and there was a rapid introduction of new styles at the time, having already been made the norm in the millinery industry. So the limitations were really not felt by the civilian population, and, quote, many thousands of yards of fabric were saved, end quote. Hats were still an essential part of women's dress, and it came in a huge variety of styles, and the continued purchase of new hats was absolutely encouraged as the de facto fashionable outlet for women whose, quote, clothing had to be simple and modest, end quote, during the years that Limitation Order 85 was in effect. Hairpins, unsurprisingly, came to be in short supply due to the metal being reappropriated, so it wasn't uncommon for salons to request women bring in pins from their last setting rather than supplying more, and as a result, placing the hair up in elaborate updos became both less feasible and less popular. And because of that, turbans, hair scarves, snoods, which is such a fun word, it's those woven hairnets that can sometimes have like pearls or gems or whatever in the netting. Anyway, and really large hats became fashionable, but not larger than 48 inches. Don't forget. Shoes were the only clothing item that received the consumer level rationing treatment. They had a couponing system, which was utilized for other products like sugar or butter, and this was mostly due to the reliance of Argentine leather for the American shoemaking industry, which predictably was slowed down by shipping and import problems throughout the war. So each person was limited to only 3 pairs of leather-based shoes a year via those issued stamps. And so what ended up happening is that the fashionable who wanted change, wanted novelty, turned to oilcloth or woven hemp or cork and other materials to maintain a trendy lifestyle. However, some department stores would accept rationing stamps intended for other goods such as sugar for leather shoes. In Jennifer Mower's dissertation, she interviewed 30 women who were either teenagers or young adults during the Second World War, and of the 30, quote, 5 women recalled that wooden shoes were popular. Wooden shoes did not require a shoe stamp, and they kept feet dry in the rain. The shoes had wooden soles and leather uppers, end quote. The wedge shoe, which was made with cork or wooden soles and hemp or other fiber uppers, became especially popular in this era, as well as rope-soled shoes referred to as wedgies, which is unfortunate and funny. Fashionable shoes were colorful. They utilized a diverse array of materials to include felt or raffia, or were crocheted or plaited cellophane, which reminds me of the jelly shoes of the 1990s, but way more work went into them. They're so cute. Families, especially the young women, also took to home mending their shoes, and this was mostly due to a shortage of supplies in the local shoemaker or cobbler shops, where old shoes would traditionally have just been resold or given new life in some way. And so some of the really clever innovations included the use of pipe cleaners or home-use cellophane, which was commonly used to wrap meats or other food items, you know, like we do with saran wrap, or even felt patches.
Your fish are dead.
Yeah, I know.
Can't get them out of there.
Elastic and rubber were both, predictably, among the ration non-apparel items throughout the war, which naturally impacted the undergarment industry. With Limitation Order 90, which was developed to address the rubber shortage, girdles were immediately effective. As a supportive garment, just like with bras today, clothing is generally designed with the underthings in mind. As a result, the elimination of the girdle was, to put it mildly, out of the question. So, the War Production Board got to work trying to develop a series of alternatives to include knitted girdles, which were, quote, garments composed of alternating strips of cloth and elastic, end quote. And there were press releases that were drafted to, encourage women to extend the lives of their existing girdles with darning techniques that are supposed to not harm the elastic. And unfortunately, because of these limitations, girdles for larger women swiftly began to resemble the now very out-of-date corset, complete with boning to make up for the lack of the multi-way stretch cloth utilized in, quote, heavier girdles, end quote. Eventually, the War Production Board had hoped to utilize synthetic rubber for consumer use, but the limitation order didn't last long enough to see a substantial enough shift in the synthetics development to alleviate the shortage for non-military use. Just 2 years after the restriction of elastic and rubber in girdles and stockings in Limitation Order 90, the order was repealed due to overwhelming complaints from women nationwide that, quote, foundation garments were an essential part of a woman's wardrobe and as such should continue to be manufactured despite the precious rubber involved, end quote, which I love. Yes, ladies, you fight. Throughout the first half of the 20th century, man-made fibers were being explored at a rapid rate in the United States. Originally born from a desire to create an inexpensive alternative to silk in the 1800s, a material that was only available via extremely costly import, rayon quickly became the textile production industry of choice. American production of the fiber began in 1911 and, quote, from 1938 forward, rayon has assumed a place among textile fibers second only to cotton, end quote. An alternative to and an adulterant for natural fiber textiles, most clothing manufactured in the Second World War were composed, at least in part, of rayon. Manufacturers across the nation refitted their looms to enable production of wartime products from both natural fibers as well as man-made, such as nylon. Other innovative textile alternatives explored and limitedly used throughout the Second World War include Aralac, which is my favorite little factoid to throw out to my lactose intolerant friends, because sometimes you don't have a lactose intolerance, you have a casein intolerance. And can you guess what Aralac is made of? You got it. It's a casein-based fiber, which is the same protein that's found in milk as well as hemp, which had previously been illegal in the United States. What's funny about Aralac is that it was reported to have a smell of rotten milk when it got wet. How gross. It wasn't durable and it didn't last very long as a textile base, but that's my favorite little factoid of 30s and 40s textile developments. Anyway. One wonder fiber that cannot be overlooked when discussing wartime rationing in the Second World War is nylon, developed and introduced by the DuPont Nemours Company in the interwar years. In 1926, Wallace Carruthers, an organic chemist employed by DuPont, began his first series of research and development projects under the company's fundamental research program. Through this program, Carruthers focused on the development of superpolymers. In April 1930, Carruthers and one of his closest associates, Julian Hill, quote, formed a polyester with a much higher molecular weight than before. The cooled fibers became strong and elastic when pulled out, creating the first fully synthetic fiber. A series of improvements were made on the synthetic fiber, and in 1935, Fiber 66, otherwise known as nylon, was developed and selected for full-scale production at DuPont. Patented in late 1938, DuPont announced the production of the silk-like product specifically targeting women's hosiery. March 1939 saw the first sample stockings sold to company employees, and in May 1940, 800,000 pairs were sold. By late 1940, it had become so popular that nylon became synonymous with stockings, just like how we say Kleenex instead of face tissue, or whatever the generic phrase would be, because I only ever call it Kleenex. Unfortunately, the production of nylon was redirected to military needs after the United States entered World War II in December of 1941. Therefore, the remaining hosiery nylons became a symbol of luxury, as the only women who owned them were either wealthy enough to remain idle, because nylon stockings would run or stretch with use over time, or wealthy enough to purchase them on the black market. At its height, a pair of nylons could go for as much as $20 or over $300 today. Nylons were so valuable, in fact, that in Chicago, quote, police ruled out robbery as the motive in a murder case because the perpetrator had left behind 6 pairs of nylons at the crime scene, end quote. Even before the freezing of silk orders, hosiery was already facing a difficult path. Nylons were a fast favorite upon introduction in 1940, but the repurposing of nylon for parachutes removed that option of the hosiery to the general public. Rayon hosiery was developed in 1941, and cotton yarn began to be redirected to the development for useful hosiery. However, neither of them could create the sheer hosiery of proper quality and were really unpopular. Because rayon stockings were viewed as the ugly, lesser option to nylon, women began to think creatively to create the illusion of stockings that they lacked. And one popular trick that you may have seen online is to simulate the seam of nylon stockings with an eyebrow pencil on the back of the legs. Women would tan or otherwise color their legs with specifically marketed leg makeup, such as leg silk, which was sold by the Langley Co., and then utilize those eyebrow pencils to draw a line down the back of the leg where a nylon or silk stocking seam would have traditionally been visible. It should be said, though, this was not a foolproof plan. It was not uncommon for liquid stockings to be streaky or uneven or come in super unnatural or unflattering colors, which is not wholly unlike liquid tanning products used today if you don't know what you're looking for, aka why I don't self-tan. Staining of bed sheets and clothing was super common, and lesser quality makeup would rub or sweat off with almost no effort. In one interview, Priscilla Hargraves of Wisconsin recalled that the subpar stocking options wouldn't have mattered had slacks been more socially acceptable outside of the workforce. So while the patriotic woman was expected to be a strong, masculine-looking Rosie the Riveter by day, in the evening, after work, she was expected to return to her feminine persona. Quote, "We are producing a certain number of yards of cloth per year. After the war program, foreign programs, and our industrial and agricultural needs are provided for, only so much is left for civilians. If we all save and conserve, we can have what we actually need during the war," end quote. Although most of the limitations weren't quite as apparent to the average consumer in that they didn't have coupon-based rationing schemes for everything, they nonetheless absolutely dictated the machinations of the American fashion industry and thus defined the fashion of the Second World War era. I probably had the most fun doing the research for this, and I did rely really heavily on Megan Mason's dissertation. So I'm going to list all of my references like usual, and there are a lot. I have a real affinity to the Second World War from a social standpoint, specifically when it comes to fashion impacts, if you haven't already picked that up. So if you have any ideas about what you might like to see from this era, please leave it in the comments below. Thank you guys for joining me on this ride. I hope that you guys had as much fun as I did. Don't forget to like and subscribe and leave your thoughts in the comments below and continue the discussion in the comments below, and I will see you all in the next one. Bye! That quote ended with pulled out a while ago.